I was standing in a wedding dress that cost less than the flowers on a single table, holding a glass of champagne I hadn't touched, when my father's lawyer walked up to me with a sealed envelope and said, "Camila, your father asked me to give you this after the vows. He said you'd understand." I didn't understand. Not yet. But 240 guests were watching. The string quartet had just finished the last note of Pachelbel's canon, and my new husband's hand was still warm in mine. I opened it anyway. 3 years earlier, my father had looked me in the eyes across his mahogany desk, the one that took 4 men to carry into his office, and said, "Marry the farmhand and you lose $180 million. Every peso, every hectare. I will write you out of everything by Friday." He wasn't bluffing. Rogelio Fuentes never bluffed. He'd built an agribusiness empire, cattle, grain, 3 processing plants, and 40,000 hectares across 2 states, out of nothing but stubbornness and a willingness to make people afraid of him. I was his only daughter, and for 26 years I had been the proof that he could build something soft out of something hard. What he didn't calculate is that inside that envelope was a document that would end not my inheritance, but his empire. I need to back up, because you won't understand what that document meant, or why my hands were steady when I read it, unless you understand what it cost me to get there, and what it had already cost my father, decades before I was born, to build the thing he was so afraid of losing. My name is Camila Fuentes Ibarra. I'm 29 years old. I have a degree in agronomy from the State University, a minor in food supply logistics, and 11 years of Saturdays spent walking cattle pens beside my father before I could legally drive. I wasn't the daughter who wanted the empire handed to her. I was the daughter who wanted to earn the right to run it. That distinction mattered to nobody in my family except me, and it turned out to matter enormously to the outcome of everything that followed. Fuentes Agropecuaria was not old money. My grandfather, Aurelio Fuentes, had been a cattle broker with a truck and a debt problem. My father took what little land the family had, 11 hectares of scrubland nobody wanted in the 1980s, and through methods he described vaguely as aggressive acquisition, turned it into 40,000 hectares by the time I was in high school. He liked to tell that story at dinner parties. He never told the other story, the one about how those first parcels of land actually came into the family. I didn't know that story existed until I was 26. I met Mateo Reyes on the northern ranch, the one we called El Alamo, during a summer when I was supposed to be shadowing the ranch manager, and instead spent most of my time trying not to be noticed shadowing one specific farmhand. He was 28, quiet in the particular way that competent people are quiet. He didn't need to announce what he knew. He'd been working cattle since he was 12. He could read a herd's mood from 200 meters away, diagnose a sick calf before the vet arrived, and fix an irrigation pump with parts scavenged from 3 broken ones. He'd never finished secondary school. He also spoke, I would later learn, in the careful, exact sentences of someone raised by a grandmother who had taught him that words were the only thing nobody could repossess. I didn't fall for him because he was handsome, although he was. I fell for him the day I watched him spend 4 hours in the rain repositioning a fence line so a pregnant heifer wouldn't have to cross a flooded gully on his own time, off the clock, because he said the animal didn't ask to be scared. My father had never once, in my entire life, done something because an animal or a person didn't ask for their suffering. That contrast was the whole engine of what happened next. Everything about Mateo made visible, by comparison, everything my father had trained me not to notice about himself. We kept it quiet for 8 months. Ranch hands and the owner's daughter. You don't need me to explain why. When my father found out, it wasn't from me. It was from Ernesto, the ranch foreman, who reported it the way you'd report a fence breach. My father called me into his office that night. He didn't yell. He never yelled. He opened a leather folder, slid a single sheet of paper across the desk, and told me to read it. It was a draft amendment to his will. My name, removed from every clause. In its place, a single line naming my cousin Rodrigo as sole heir to Fuentes Agropecuaria. Marry the farmhand, he said, and you lose $180 million. I will sign this by Friday if you don't end it. I want to tell you, I had a witty comeback. I didn't. I sat there and did the math on what $180 million actually meant. 3 processing plants, 40,000 hectares, a name that opened doors in 4 states. And then I did a different kind of math, the kind you can't put in a spreadsheet, about what it would mean to spend the rest of my life married to a man my father had chosen for his balance sheet instead of for me. I didn't cry in that office. I counted to 10 twice and told him I needed time to think. I took 3 months, not because I was undecided, I knew by the second week, but because I am my father's daughter in exactly one respect. I don't make an irreversible decision without first understanding every consequence of it. So while my father assumed I was weighing love against money, I was quietly doing something else entirely. I was going through the archive. Fuentes Agropecuaria kept 40 years of land records, contracts, and correspondence in a converted grain silo behind the main house, a room my father called the vault, and treated with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never once imagined his own daughter would read those files against him. I told him I wanted to to understand the business before I walked away from it, which was true, just not in the way he assumed. I spent Sunday afternoons in that silo, cross-referencing land titles against tax filings, and that's where the first thread appeared. There was a parcel, 11 hectares, the original 11 hectares my grandfather had supposedly built the whole empire from, with a title history that didn't match the story my family told at dinner parties. The 1979 deed wasn't a purchase. It was a foreclosure, and the name on the original title, before my grandfather's name appeared, was Anselmo Reyes. Reyes, Mateo's surname. I didn't say anything to Mateo.
Not yet.
I told myself it was probably a coincidence. Reyes is not an uncommon name in that region, and I kept pulling threads anyway, because I am not a person who leaves a thread unpulled once I found the end of it. What I found over the following weeks was not a coincidence. It was a pattern, and patterns are worse than coincidences, because patterns mean someone did it on purpose. I married Mateo anyway, 6 weeks after my father's deadline came and went. I signed a notarized renunciation of inheritance in front of 2 witnesses and a notary public the same week. My father's lawyer insisted on it, said he wanted it clean, said he didn't want any ambiguity about my claim to Fuentes Agropecuaria after the wedding. I signed it without hesitation, because by then I already suspected something my father did not, that the empire he was so desperate to keep out of my hands might not entirely be his to give away in the first place. The wedding was small, 80 people, a rented hall 2 towns over, Mateo's grandmother crying through the entire ceremony in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. My father did not attend. My mother came quietly, without telling him, and left before the reception ended, so she could be home before he noticed. I want to be clear that I didn't marry Mateo as an act of rebellion. I married him because 4 years into knowing him, he was still the only person in my life who had never once asked me to be smaller than I was.
That's not a small thing.
In my family, it was the rarest thing there was. What neither my father nor I knew on that wedding day was that the document sitting in my lawyer's office, the one I'd spent 11 months building, quietly, methodically, alongside a land title attorney named Beatriz Solano and a forensic document examiner who specialized in reading 50-year-old paper, was about to make its way to a very different kind of reception than the one we'd planned. Here is what I found and how I found it, because the how matters as much as the what. The 1979 foreclosure document had a signature on it, Anselmo Reyes, releasing his claim to the 11 hectares in exchange for debt forgiveness on a loan he'd allegedly taken from a rural credit cooperative my grandfather happened to control a majority stake in. On paper, it looked clean.
Foreclosures happened.
Rural credit cooperatives failed farmers constantly in that decade. It was one of the ugly, ordinary tragedies of agricultural policy in that era, and nobody would have linked at one more name on one more list. Except Anselmo Reyes had died in 1994, and his son, Mateo's father, Higinio Reyes, had spent the last 11 years of his life, before his own death in 2015, writing letters. I found them in a box in the silo, misfiled under a folder labeled Correspondence, Miscellaneous, Discard, which told me everything about how seriously my father's office had taken them at the time. Higinio Reyes had written to a state land registry, to 2 attorneys, and once, in 2009, directly to my father, asking for a review of the 1979 transfer. He believed, and had apparently believed his entire adult life, that his father's signature on the foreclosure release was forged, executed while Anselmo was hospitalized following a stroke, at a time when he could not have physically signed his own name, let alone understood what he was signing away. My father's response, dated 3 weeks later, was 4 sentences long. It informed Higinio Reyes that the matter had been reviewed and closed, and that further correspondence on this subject would be forwarded to legal counsel. There was no review. I checked. There was no file, no engagement letter, no billing record from any law firm indicating that a review had ever taken place. My father had simply said the word reviewed the way you'd wave away a fly, and it had worked, because Higinio Reyes was a farmhand with no money for a lawyer and no idea that 15 years later his own son would fall in love with the granddaughter of the man who'd taken his father's land. I hired Beatriz Solano. The same month I started going through the silo, I told her I wanted a full title chain review on the northern parcels, framed as due diligence for a possible restructuring, which, again, was not exactly a lie, just not the whole truth. She brought in a forensic document examiner named Dr. Amelia Cruz, who specializes in what's formally called parentage graphoscopico, signature and handwriting analysis on aged documents. It took her 6 weeks and access to 3 known exemplars of Anselmo Reyes's genuine signature, pulled from military service records, and a 1971 voter registration card to reach her conclusion. The signature on the 1979 foreclosure release did not match. The pressure points, the letter formation, the pen lift patterns, all inconsistent with the genuine exemplars, and consistent, she noted carefully in her report, with a signature produced by someone attempting to replicate another person's handwriting from a template, likely traced or closely copied from an existing document rather than written freely. I read that report at 11 at night, alone in the small house Mateo and I were renting 2 kilometers from the ranch, and I did not cry. I sat very still for a long time, and then I made a pot of coffee because I already knew what I was going to do with it, and I wanted to be awake enough to do it properly. I didn't go to my father. Not yet. A confrontation without leverage is just an argument, and my father had spent 30 years winning arguments through sheer force of certainty. I needed something he couldn't out-argue. So for the next 5 months, while my father believed I had disappeared quietly into a farmhand's modest life exactly as he'd predicted I would, humbled and inheritance-less, I was in Beatriz Solano's office twice a month, building a case file that would eventually run to 211 pages. We didn't stop at the 11 hectares. Once you know to look for one forged signature, you start checking the others, and it turned out my grandfather's aggressive acquisition strategy in the late 70s and early 80s had a discernible pattern. 5 separate parcels, all acquired from smallholder farmers within a 4-year window, all through the same rural credit cooperative, all featuring loan documents and release signatures that, on closer forensic examination, showed troubling similarities in formation to signatures Aurelio Fuentes himself was known to produce. Not identical. Whoever did this was careful enough to vary the strokes, but similar enough. Dr. Cruz noted that a common author across multiple signatures could not be ruled out and was, in her professional opinion, more likely than not. 5 parcels, 14,200 hectares, nearly 36% of the total land holdings that would eventually become Fuentes Agropecuaria. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters. I did not do this research to destroy my father. For a long time, longer than I'm proud of, I told myself I was doing it so that I could go to him privately, show him what I'd found, and give him the chance to make it right quietly. Negotiated settlements with the surviving families, a foundation, something. I believed, right up until about 6 weeks before the wedding, that there was a version of this story where my father, faced with the truth, chose to do the harder, better thing. I stopped believing that the day I finally requested a meeting to show him a portion of what I'd found. Not everything, just the 11 hectares. Just Anselmo Reyes, 3 weeks before my wedding to his son. My father listened to 11 minutes of Beatriz Solano's summary, then stood up, walked to his office door, opened it, and said, "This meeting is over. If any part of this leaves this room, I will bury both of you in litigation so deep your grandchildren will still be paying my lawyers." Then he looked directly at me and added, "You renounced your inheritance. You have no standing here. This isn't your business anymore." That sentence, "You have no standing here," was the moment the version of this story where I stayed quiet died completely. Because he was wrong, and I already knew he was wrong, and I let him believe otherwise for 3 more weeks while Beatriz Solano and I finished the last piece of the filing. He was wrong for a specific technical reason that I did not explain to him that day because I wanted him to find out the way he was about to find out publicly and too late to stop it. My inheritance renunciation, the one his own lawyer had insisted I sign clean, released my claim to Fuentes Agropecuaria as it existed on the date of signing. It said nothing because it couldn't, because neither of us knew it yet, about parcels of that land to which the company's title was never legitimately valid in the first place. You cannot renounce a claim to something that was never rightfully the estate's to give you. And more importantly, I wasn't the one withstanding anymore. Mateo was. Because 3 weeks after that meeting, Mateo Reyes, grandson of Anselmo Reyes, son of Higinio Reyes, the last living direct descendant with a documented, decades-long paper trail of contested claim, was going to become my husband and the surviving heir with the strongest legal standing to challenge the title on that land. My father built his empire on 11 hectares he stole from a dying man in 1979, and I married that dying man's great-grandson in front of 240 witnesses on the same ranch that land had eventually become part of. That's what was in the envelope. Not a threat, not a disowning. My father, it turned out, hadn't sent that envelope to punish me on my wedding day at all. I found that out later, and it changes very little about what happened next, but it's worth telling you the truth of it. He'd sent it because his lawyer had advised him, 2 days before the wedding, that a title chain inquiry had been filed with the state land registry requesting historical review of 5 parcels associated with Fuentes Agropecuaria, cross-referenced against a forensic signature analysis submitted by an outside firm, Beatriz Solano's firm.
He didn't know it was me.
He assumed, incorrectly, that one of the surviving families from the other 4 parcels had finally found a lawyer willing to take the case. 40 years too late for anyone to care. He sent me that envelope, a copy of his 1979 acquisition records, annotated with his own handwritten note reading, so you understand what you're about to lose access to, as one last attempt to make me feel the weight of the fortune I'd walked away from. A parting cruelty disguised as information. He wanted me to open it during my own wedding reception and feel, one final time, exactly how much smaller my life was about to become. Instead, I stood in my wedding dress, holding a document that confirmed, in my father's own handwriting, that he knew knew precisely which 5 parcels were under review, a level of specificity the public filing hadn't yet disclosed, meaning he'd learned about it through a source inside the land registry, which was, incidentally, a separate and serious problem for him, since unauthorized access to a pending title inquiry is itself a violation with regulatory consequences. He had, in trying to wound me, handed me physical proof that he already knew, on some level, exactly what those 5 parcels represented and exactly what he stood to lose if the truth came out. I didn't make a scene. That's not how I do things, and it's not how Beatrice Solano had advised me to do things either. I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and finished my wedding. I danced with my husband. I ate the cake. I let my father's cruelty land exactly as far as the envelope and no further, because I had already set something in motion that no reception hall speech could stop, and I wanted, more than I wanted to confront him in that moment, to simply have one full, uncomplicated day that belonged only to Mateo and me. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't at the wedding. It came 6 weeks later. At a family gathering, my father convened himself, a dinner at the main house, ostensibly to discuss the future of the ranch's northern operations with Rodrigo, his newly minted heir, and a handful of senior managers. I wasn't invited. Mateo obviously wasn't either. But Beatrice Solano had, by then, formally filed a title challenge on behalf of the Reyes family estate, and part of proper procedure meant that Fuentes Agropecuaria, as the current title holder, received formal notice of the claim delivered at Beatrice's insistence and with my full agreement by process server in person at the main house at 7 o'clock in the evening during that exact dinner. I wasn't there to see it. I didn't need to be. Rodrigo texted me 40 minutes later. Rodrigo, who I hadn't spoken to since the will amendment, who apparently decided that whatever loyalty he owed my father didn't extend to staying silent about what he'd just watched. His message said only he turned white. Then he asked everyone to leave. What did you do? What I did was simple, procedurally, even if it wasn't emotionally simple at all. I let the system do what my father had spent 30 years assuming it would never do to him. I let it look closely. Over the following 4 months, the collapse moved faster than even Beatrice had predicted. The state land registry's formal review confirmed what Dr. Cruz's forensic analysis had already found. The 1979 signature did not match Anselmo Reyes's known exemplars, and 2 of the other 4 contested signatures showed the same irregularities. That alone didn't undo 40 years of title, but it triggered something my father hadn't anticipated. It flagged Fuentes Agropecuaria for a broader compliance review, because land title irregularities of that scale, once formally confirmed, obligate the registry to notify the tax authority, since land valuations tied to those parcels had been used for decades in agricultural tax assessments, loan collateral filings, and this was the part that actually broke the company, a debt refinancing package my father had taken out 4 years earlier, using 40,000 hectares as collateral, 14,200 of which were now under a formal title dispute. The bank found out before I did, honestly. Collateral under active legal challenge is a covenant violation on nearly every commercial loan structure, and Fuentes Agropecuaria's refinancing agreement was no exception. Within 6 weeks of the title challenge becoming public record, the bank issued a formal notice of default, not because my father had missed a payment, but because the collateral securing $60 million of that debt could no longer be reliably valued. He had 30 days to either post substitute collateral or face acceleration of the full loan balance. He didn't have it. That was the part that surprised me most, if I'm honest. Not that the land might be contested, but that $180 million empire, in the way these things so often are, turned out to be built on far less liquidity than its size implied. Land-rich, cash-poor, leveraged against itself in ways that only become visible when something forces a very close look. The something, in this case, was 5 forged signatures from 1979 and 1981. By the time the tax authority opened its own audit, a formal SAT review triggered automatically once the registry flagged the valuation discrepancies. Fuentes Agropecuaria was already in a form of financial freefall that had nothing left to do with my marriage or my father's wounded pride. Auditors don't care about family drama. They care about 4 decades of tax filings built on land valuations that could no longer be substantiated, and once they started pulling that thread, they found what auditors always find when they're finally allowed to look closely at something for the first time in 40 years. Inconsistencies that had nothing to do with the Reyes family at all. Underreported herd counts in 3 fiscal years. A processing plant valuation that hadn't been updated since 2003, despite 2 expansions. A pattern of related party transactions with a shell company that, it turned out, existed primarily to route certain expenses in ways that reduced my father's reported personal tax liability by an amount the auditor's preliminary assessment placed conservatively in the low 8 figures over a decade. None of that was my doing. I want to be completely clear about that, because there's a version of this story where it would be easy to make it sound like I orchestrated my father's entire downfall from a farmhouse 2 kilometers away, and that's not true, and it's not the kind of victory I wanted anyway. I pulled one thread. The thread led to a shirt that had been unraveling on its own for years, held together by exactly the kind of certainty my father had built his entire personality around. The certainty that no one would ever look because no one ever had before. By January, 7 months after my wedding, Fuentes Agropecuaria had entered what our lawyers here call concurso mercantil, a formal insolvency proceeding, essentially bankruptcy protection, filed not by my father but by the bank, after the 30-day collateral cure period expired with no resolution. The Northern Ranch, El Alamo, the 14,200 hectares under title dispute, the exact place where Mateo and I had fallen in love, was placed under judicial administration pending final resolution of the Reyes family's claim. The two processing plants were sold within 4 months to a competitor at what our own accountant, reviewing the public filings out of what I can only describe as professional curiosity, called a distressed valuation, roughly 60% of what they'd been worth 18 months earlier. Rodrigo, the newly minted sole heir, inherited a company that no longer meaningfully existed, along with what I'm told was a legal bill that outpaced anything he'd been promised in that leather folder. My father did not go to prison. I want to be honest about that too, because I know some of you are waiting for that ending, and it isn't the ending that happened. Forgery from 1979 falls under statutes of limitation that had long since expired, and proving he personally forged the signatures, rather than, say, a cooperative loan officer acting under his direction, or someone else entirely, was never going to meet a criminal standard 45 years after the fact. The tax fraud findings were civil and administrative, resulting in penalties, back taxes, and interest that consumed most of what remained of his personal assets after the company's collapse. But no criminal charges were filed. Sometimes the truth doesn't come with handcuffs. Sometimes it just comes with the slow, complete disassembly of everything a person built their identity around, which is its own kind of consequence, even if it isn't the kind you can watch on a courtroom live stream. The Reyes family's title claim was ultimately settled rather than fully litigated to judgment. Beatriz advised me, correctly, that a settlement guaranteeing the return of the original 11 hectares plus a negotiated compensation package for the remaining 14,200 funded through the bankruptcy estate was a more certain outcome than years of further appeals against a company that no longer had money to pay a judgment even if we won one outright. Mateo and I now hold clear title to the original 11 hectares his great-grandfather lost in 1979. We didn't take the rest of it. That wasn't an act of generosity so much as an act of exhaustion. Neither of us wanted to become the kind of people who measure their worth in hectares, which was, in the end, the entire disease that had built and then destroyed my father's life. My mother left him during the bankruptcy proceedings quietly, the way she'd done everything for 30 years, and now lives 40 minutes from us in a small house she bought outright in cash from savings my father apparently never knew she had, which tells you something about their marriage that I never fully understood until I watched her finally stop performing loyalty to a man who'd never once asked what she actually wanted. She visits most Sundays. She and Mateo get along in a way she and my father never did, which I think surprises her more than it surprises me. I see my father twice a year now, at most. He lives in a modest apartment in the city, works as a consultant for smaller agricultural operations, and has never once, in any of those visits, said the words, "I'm sorry," or acknowledged what the 1979 documents actually showed. The closest he's come was during our last visit, 6 months ago, when he looked at me across a kitchen table so much smaller than his old mahogany desk and said, "I built that company so you'd never have to depend on anyone." I told him the truth, which was that I hadn't needed an empire to depend on no one. I needed a father who told the truth, and $180 million had never once been a substitute for that. Not for me, and I suspect not for him either, though I don't think he'll ever say so out loud. Mateo and I run 11 hectares now, the original 11, the ones his great-grandfather worked before a hospital bed and a stolen signature took them away. We're building it slowly, cattle, some grain, and a small operation training rescued and rehomed farm animals that started almost by accident and has become, unexpectedly, the thing I'm proudest of in my professional life. It is a fraction, a genuine, literal fraction, less than 1,000th of what I renounced the day I signed that notarized document. I have never once regretted it, and I want to be precise about why, because I think the reason matters more than the drama of how it all unraveled. My father spent 30 years teaching me that land was the only thing that couldn't be taken from you if you held it tightly enough. What actually happened is that the land he held so tightly was never fully his to hold in the first place, and holding on to something you don't rightfully own doesn't make you secure. It makes you vulnerable to the one thing certainty can never protect you from, which is the truth eventually being looked at closely by someone with nothing left to lose. I didn't marry Mateo to bring down an empire. I married him because he was the first person in my life who made me feel like my worth had nothing to do with what I stood to inherit. It turned out the universe had its own sense of justice about that, timed almost cruelly well, arriving in a sealed envelope envelope on the one day my father was certain he still held all the leverage. He was wrong about the farmhand. He was wrong about the 11 hectares. And he was wrong, most of all, about what he thought he was protecting when he told his daughter that love was worth less than $180 million. He was protecting a lie. I just happened to be standing close enough and patient enough to watch it finally come apart.